Hello and welcome back. In the last video, we discussed the philosophy of Georg Hegel, and now we turn to consider that other great post-Kantian philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer. Being contemporaries, Schopenhauer was famously rival to Hegel, both in his ideas and in his life. As we shall see, Schopenhauer's philosophy is incredibly productive, but in spite of this, he was a fairly bitter and arrogant personality. When he joined the University of Berlin, he scheduled his lectures to coincide with Hegel's, whom he believed to be a charlatan that had corrupted Kant's system. Unfortunately, Hegel was very well liked at this time, and so Schopenhauer's lecture hall went empty. Hegel lived the life that Schopenhauer perhaps thought should have been his, and his inability to overcome his rival led him to eventually abandon his career as an academic altogether. But a perhaps more reasonable reason why Schopenhauer was not too fond of Hegel was that their philosophies were in many ways opposite characterizations of a very similar theme. Hegel was all about progress and optimism, while Schopenhauer was a pessimist that focused on, and had to endure, perhaps more so than Hegel, the sufferings and hardships of life. In what follows, we shall see that both thinkers held a very important but mutually contradictory piece of the puzzle of life, and that if only they could have worked together, they might have found the complete image. If you find these videos useful, your support would really go a long way in helping me to continue. You can find out how to support me in the description below. Thank you, and enjoy. So, to briefly summarise, Schopenhauer's philosophy is built on the Kantian critique of the intellect, arguing that time, space, and causality are not real in an absolute sense, but are forms of perception that structure experience. As we have seen, this leads to the possibility of a transcendental reality, a thing in itself that is beyond intellectual comprehension, though, for Schopenhauer, the noumenon is sensible through our inner experience of will. Schopenhauer believed that life is dominated by passion, need, pain, and fear, all driven by the will, which he saw as the true essence of reality. Schopenhauer argues that the phenomenal world is the means by which the will represents itself, and the opposition of subject and object is the first general and essential form of representation. All representations are governed by the law of sufficient reason. So, for instance, our perception of being a physical body in a physical world is a rational representation of sensations like sight and sound. As we saw earlier, a similar idea can be found in the Yogacara tradition of Buddhism, where phenomena are transformations of consciousness. And Kant also conveys this view through the revelation that empirical reality is transcendental ideality. The perceived world is ideal in origin because it is shaped by the structures of cognition. However, while Kant maintained that the thing in itself is unknowable, insofar as it transcends these structures, Schopenhauer believed that it could be partially apprehended through the introspective analysis of the empirical self. Indeed, it is our inner experience of willing, the striving, desiring, and restless energy that we feel at the core of our being, which provides us a window to the true nature of the world. Our individual sense of self is like a microcosm of the macrocosmic will. The will, for Schopenhauer, is the essence of life, shining through the veil of representations. The will to live, with all its desires and fears, is thus the ultimate reality, meaning that life is fundamentally ruled by desire and fear and lust. Schopenhauer's concept of the will is therefore in stark contrast to Hegel's notion of spirit. The will is irrational and purposeless, striving without any ultimate aim, while Hegel's spirit is rational and purposeful, striving for the realization of freedom and self-consciousness. But, despite these differences, both concepts share a dynamic, striving quality that propels evolution forward. Schopenhauer's will is blind causality, whereas Hegel's spirit is a structured, teleological process. What the concept of the will does sound like is the Buddhist notion of Tanha, or craving, which is intrinsically linked to dukkha, or suffering, as a consequence of the transient nature of existence as outlined in the Buddha's first noble truth. This implies that Schopenhauer's idea of the thing in itself has nothing in common with the Buddhist notion of emptiness, because craving in Buddhism is associated with a state of ignorance which keeps us bound in samsara. Indeed, samsara would be the Buddhist counterpart to Schopenhauer's representation, where the world is viewed through the lens of the will. Nirvana, on the other hand, which is the state of liberation and peace, would arise only when we escape the force of the will. If the will is that which generates representations and fuels samsara, then it does not make much sense to associate that with the Buddhist emptiness, which is the lack of inherent existence or subject-object duality. Schopenhauer's will is the ground of being, and therefore a positive thing. It would make more sense, however, to relate the will to the Yogacara concept of Alaya-Vijnana, or storehouse consciousness, which is the referent of emptiness, and which serves as the underlying basis for experience, manifesting as the phenomenal world through volitional activity. Of course, to avoid positing the will as a self, we would have to recognize that it is inseparable from its representations, and is therefore empty of intrinsic existence. Schopenhauer indeed recognized this. He denies that the will is self-aware or deliberate, and it is not a fixed substance, but a dynamic process that is inseparable from its representations. Schopenhauer asserts that our existence has no ground or bottom other than the ever-fleeting present, and this does appear to align with the Buddhist notion of emptiness, insofar as both reject a fixed foundation within phenomena. So, this makes Schopenhauer sound like a Buddhist philosopher, and this becomes even more apparent when considering his solution to the problem of suffering. If pure will is a positive expression of reality, then will-lessness is its negative expression, and the distinction between will and will-lessness mirrors the structure of the Buddhist non-duality between dependent origination and emptiness, and indeed samsara and nirvana, craving and the cessation of craving. The way that Schopenhauer characterizes this idea is as the transcending of the will, or the negation or rejection of the will. When this occurs, insight into the illusory nature of phenomena is revealed, mirroring the Madhyamika assertion that phenomena are empty of inherent existence. I'm going to read a couple passages from Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, which explicate this similarity. First, from the end of the first volume. Once our considerations have finally brought us to the point where we, in complete saintliness, are contemplating denial and abandonment of all willing, and thus deliverance from a world whose entire existence has shown itself to be suffering, this now appears to us as a passage into empty nothingness. That is because the will is everything we know, all phenomena being its representation, and so when there is no willing, there is no world. However, it's not all doom and gloom. He continues, if you insist on somehow acquiring a positive knowledge of that which philosophy can express only negatively as denial of the will, then I can only point to the state experienced by all those who have achieved complete denial of the will, the state that is given the names ecstasy, rapture, illumination, union with God, and so on. But this state really shouldn't be called knowledge, because it no longer has the form of subject and object, the knower and the known, and is, moreover, available only in one's own experience and can't be further communicated. As a matter of fact, in the second volume, Schopenhauer identifies this realization of nothing with nirvana, so we can see here a subtle association by Schopenhauer of non-dual wisdom and the rejection of the will. Remember, if everything is an expression of the will, and if liberation is possible, then this will must be able to manifest itself as will-lessness, because of course the liberated person still has existence as a phenomenal representation of the will. They do not simply vanish from existence. Therefore, Schopenhauer's will is both the force which binds us to suffering and that which leads us to liberation when sufficiently understood and transcended. And I think this fact is what will allow us to unite Schopenhauer with his principal adversary, Georg Hegel. That is because the poison is the cure idea can be found in Hegel, where the dialectic is both the force that propels life forward and the challenge that life seeks to overcome. For Hegel, dialectical striving must negate itself, and for Schopenhauer, the will must negate itself. The reconciliation between these two seemingly disparate approaches lies in the non-rational nature of the insight into the groundlessness of being, because the realization that there is nothing to realize, nothing to do, no limitation to overcome, conveys that it is okay to let oneself fall into the abyss. This is because absolutely anyone could surrender the will and cease from striving at any time. There is nothing one needs to do in order to achieve this, because it is precisely to stop trying to do anything. It is the opposite of what rational thought would usually have us strive for, and it is the opposite of what emotional feeling would usually have us strive for, because both signal the absence of a problem. Reason and emotion are both things that drive the entire process of reality, and both can be characterized as forms of will, forms of striving for more knowledge, or more happiness. It is simply that Schopenhauer sees reason as subordinate to emotion, while Hegel sees emotion as subordinate to reason. And you cannot negate the will by willing to rationally understand why it is okay to negate the will. This is not enough to satisfy the will. True renunciation requires a non-rational transformation that alters one's relationship with oneself, from selfishness to selflessness, and this is fundamentally a moral act. It is also not a passive act. It is a moral cessation, to let go of yourself. And this is why liberation is always possible in each and every moment we enjoy as conscious beings. The enlightened state does not ever do anything. It is only the ego that can act, and it is only the ego that can cease from acting and allow the light of wisdom to shine through. And so, the act which is no act is an insight. For when we cease from clinging to ourselves and to the notion that we can succeed at solving a problem, then the solution makes itself perfectly clear. It is a non-rational insight because it only becomes visible when the intellect negates itself, when it accepts that there is nothing to realize. Only when we realize that there is nothing to realize do we shift from that which needs to realize to that which already knows that there is nothing to realize. We have realized it, as an ego, but what we have realized is the unreality of that thing, so we have realized nothing. The lack of a thing to realize is the thing there is to realize, and this paradoxical state of affairs cannot be understood by the rational mind, because it genuinely makes no sense. And when the mind realizes this, there is nothing left to do. There is simply no option to go on striving. It no longer makes any sense. It no longer carries the weight of necessity. There's only so much one can say here without spoiling the whole thing. There isn't anything really I'm trying to express, but there's not simply nothing I'm trying to express. The difficulty is, again, that this is not an intellectual thing. If anything, it's an ethical thing, to surrender. In a way, all of spirituality is ultimately ethics, and our only problem is that we are not willing to not be willing, which means we are only willing to be willing. Something else that is important is the fact that Schopenhauer provides us with the means of integrating the insights of Buddhism with the insights of Western psychoanalysis, and this can be brought out by considering the similarities between Schopenhauer's will as thing in itself and the Yogacara tradition's Vijnana consciousness, both of which are active and creative. Recall that for Schopenhauer, the will manifests as the multiplicity of things via a principle of individuation, and for Yogacara, consciousness manifests as the multiplicity of phenomena in accordance with the theory of karma. In both systems, the fundamental principle is active and creative, and in both systems, this principle is interdependent and interpenetrated with the phenomena themselves. The characterizing mark of Schopenhauer's theory of this blind attraction towards life is that the will itself is unconscious, aimless, and without inherent structure. Similarly, the most fundamental level of Yogacara consciousness, the Alaya-Vijnana, or storehouse consciousness, has been compared to the Western concept of the unconscious as developed by Freud and Jung. While the will is blind striving, the Alaya-Vijnana is structured by karmic imprints which contain the latent potential for future cognitive, emotional, and perceptual experiences. This is somewhat reminiscent of Jung's theory of complexes. Schopenhauer's idea of the will to live was indeed a significant influence for both Freud and Jung's theories of the unconscious. For Freud in particular, the central motivating factor of the unconscious became the will to pleasure, or the libido. It also influenced Nietzsche's will to power, where the blind survival drive becomes more of a creative force of self-overcoming, and Nietzsche also served as a significant influence for Jung, who would integrate all of these ideas within his theory of individuation. The key point is that any association between the Western concept of the unconscious and the Eastern Alaya-Vijnana is in part a reflection of a deeper connection between Yogacara and Schopenhauer's view of the will, as the fundamental dynamic force underlying experience. We might take this back even further, because Plato's notion of eros, being a universal desire or passion or love, was the other main precursor to the psychoanalytic concept of the unconscious. Schopenhauer used the term eros to refer to a manifestation of the will which selfishly desires for reproduction, and Freud retains the term eros to refer to the will to live, or the life instinct, in his theory of libido. Jung also adopted the term eros, but he made it the complement to logos, where eros represents connection, passion, and relatedness, while logos represents structure, rationality, and differentiation. This complementary pair was also inspired by Nietzsche's distinction between the rational, ordered, Apollonian spirit and the emotional, chaotic, Dionysian spirit. And Hegel also employed the term logos, building on the ideas of Heraclitus and Christian scholasticism to refer to the unfolding of reason and to the dialectical process through which reality becomes aware of itself. So, we have in Jung another way to reconcile Schopenhauer's will, expressed as eros, with Hegel's spirit, expressed as logos, as two complementary aspects of the drive toward existence. Eros represents the dynamic, striving force of reality, logos represents its structured, rational unfolding. The distinction between eros and logos plays a key role in Jung's framework, forming the basis of his concepts of the anima, eros, and animus, logos. Individuation, or self-realization, requires integrating these principles into a harmony rather than being biased towards one. This struggle is ironically expressed in the lifelong rivalry between Schopenhauer and Hegel, between blind causality and rational teleology. Paraphilosophy offers a way to reconcile these opposing tendencies by explaining the correspondence and harmony between the causality of the will and the finality of the spirit. I have tentatively suggested that this reconciliation occurs through a form of synchronicity, potentially connected to a hidden variable or superdeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics. Synchronicity is, of course, another Jungian concept. But do you know who inspired this concept? Yes, of course, Schopenhauer again, though we also find a precursor in Leibniz's theory of a pre-established harmony. You can learn all about this in the video linked here. I should also note that this is something that has been fundamental to my own insights and experiences, which I've conveyed in previous videos as the complementary relationship between the subjective attraction towards righteousness and pleasure, which are related to Logos and Eros respectively. Peace is the state of balance between these two, or rather, it is the overcoming of them both. This is important because we do not want to overcome the will to pleasure only to become trapped by the allure of reason, nor to overcome reason only to be trapped by pleasure. I'm sure this is the same insight that is expressed in Buddhism as the middle way between asceticism and hedonism. In the video linked now, I explained that the mystical insight is an experience of the extreme of righteousness, the Logos, and the unity of opposites. And what exists at this extreme is a window back to the central point of non-duality and balance between both itself and pleasure. Consequently, there is no extreme righteousness, but merely the complementarity between the self-reference of righteousness and the other reference of pleasure. In terms of the dialectical matrix, this would refer to superjectivism and abjectivism respectively, because the superjective, concrete, universal represents the ideal of absolute truth, while abjective, abstract particulars represent the impermanent things we become attached to via the will to life. The ultimate truth is non-duality, complementarity, and the point of balance between the emptiness of the ultimate ideal and the fullness of immediate experience. And since the ultimate truth cannot relate to any of the quadrants of the dialectical matrix, the categories of existence, non-existence, both and neither cannot be applied to it. The emptiness of the ultimate does not therefore equate to the absolute non-existence of an ultimate, but rather to a union of existence and non-existence. And thus, there is no such thing as conceptual knowledge of the ultimate truth. The final thing I want to touch upon is the connection between this duality of Eros and Logos, or pleasure and righteousness, or the abjective and superjective, and ethics. First, consider that the rational drive towards higher expressions of self-consciousness, knowledge, and unity has historically been associated with the ideal of goodness. The concrete universal, which represents the unity underlying all particularities, has been exalted to a divine status in various traditions. For instance, Plato's form of the good, the One in Neoplatonism, and Absolute Spirit in Hegel's idealism, all function as metaphysical principles of unity and rationality, often linked with the good. These ideas were all associated with the Greek logos, which the Christian scholastics would describe as the manifestation and word of God. The superjective is the guiding force of consciousness, driving individuals towards a shared moral framework and promoting collective identity and ethical coherence. This principle serves as a bridge between the individual and the collective, harmonizing personal desires with universal moral values. So, if the superjective represents order, unity, truth, consciousness, and goodness, then the abjective, by comparison, would represent chaos, separation, illusion, ego, and perhaps evil. Consider that the term abject, in critical theory, refers to that which has been rejected from both our subjective identity and objective experience, much like the Jungian concept of the shadow. Abjection is the sense of horror felt when confronted with the other, that which disrupts the force which allows for the self's sense of coherence. It can also be associated with existentialist themes of angst and anxiety, as the confrontation with the absurdity of life leads to feelings of alienation and despair, a recognition of the fragility and contingency of our existence. The notion of the abject was developed by Julia Kristeva to refer to that which is neither a subject nor an object, and as a complement to Freud's notion of the superego, which represents social conscience and morality generally, and which resonates with the notion of the superjective, particularly the meta-ethical concept of the ideal observer. Whereas the superjective can be linked to the rational structures of waking consciousness, the abjective is associated with the darker side of experience, to the unconscious libidinal drive towards phenomenality. And as we just discussed, this unconscious reservoir of emotional energy is related to Schopenhauer's will and the Yogacara Alaya-Vijnana, which contains the karmic seeds of future experience. Both Schopenhauer and Yogacara explain how the will, or Vijnana, is ultimately non-dual with its representations, which are abstract particular instances of experience. And Schopenhauer developed his theory of the will on the grounds of Immanuel Kant's revelation of the synthetic a priori conditions for the possibility of experience. And again, this idea of the will to live, or the will to pleasure, can be linked quite naturally to a moral objective relativism, particularly in the normative forms of utilitarianism, egoism, or hedonism, the latter of which represents one of the extremes in Buddhism opposing asceticism. So, all this fits in very nicely with paraphilosophy and syntheology, which allows us to understand the interdependence of seemingly opposing forces. But getting now to the heart of the matter, we have arrived again at the dialectic between Schopenhauer's blind, insatiable will, which is characteristic of the abjective, and Hegel's rational, synthesizing spirit, which is characteristic of the superjective. And what is interesting about this is that both thinkers associated their ultimate principles with the concept of love. For Hegel, who associates his absolute with the Logos, love is fundamentally relational. It exists between distinct beings, connecting them through their differences. The love of Logos is not an emotion, but a concrete universal that embodies the underlying unity in diversity and the universality in individuality. Hegel's conception of love therefore emphasizes the importance of mutual recognition and the acknowledgement of the other as an integral part of one's own self-realization. It is through love that the separate individual is transcended, and individuals come to understand that their true essence is shaped by their relationships with others, moving beyond alienation and toward unity. Hegel also attributes the phenomenon of alienation to abstract particularity, to the individual who perceives themselves as separate from the universal rational order of the world. When one is disconnected from the principle of order, they naturally fall into a self-centered existence, where desires are misaligned with the ethical and social norms that constitute the essence of self-consciousness within the collective. Love, therefore, serves as the remedy for alienation, as it allows us to transcend our isolation and recognize our true place within the whole. Now, in contrast, Schopenhauer, who discusses love in relation to the contrary notion of Eros, sees love as rooted in the insatiable, primal nature of the will. The drive for reproduction and self-preservation, while essential to life, is ultimately selfish, because it arises from the will's blind striving to perpetuate itself. Love is thus the source of suffering, as desires fuel endless longing and dissatisfaction, ultimately reinforcing the cycle of willing that can never be fully satisfied. The juxtaposition of Hegel's and Schopenhauer's views on love reveals a fundamental tension between the ideals of unity and separation, rationality and emotionality, optimism and pessimism. Hegel's optimism is rooted in the belief in the potential for rational order and knowledge and ethical development, while Schopenhauer's pessimism underscores the inherent struggles and suffering that characterize human existence. However, in paraphilosophy, we understand that the superjective and the abjective are interdependent, and so there is no unity without separation, no order without disorder, no purpose without passion. Each depends on the other, and the meaning of each is given by the other. It is therefore too simplistic to characterize one thing as good and its opposite as bad. We are prompted to look beyond the duality of perspectives to the parajective, in which there is no such distinction. Indeed, Schopenhauer also offered the notion of Mitleid, a higher form of love, or compassion, which parallels the notion of agape, and which transcends the self-centered desires associated with eros. Agape embodies a more universal, selfless love that seeks the well-being of others, and was associated by Schopenhauer with asceticism and the spiritual path to liberation, which is itself the realization of the parajective. It is, therefore, the contention of paraphilosophy that Eros and Logos, so as Schopenhauer and Hegel, represent complementary aspects of the same dynamic. Eros is the chaotic, passionate, and uncontrolled primal force that pushes us forward. Logos is the rational principle that organizes and structures this drive. Logos brings coherence and meaning to the desires of Eros, directing them toward higher purposes. Through rationality, there is space for choice, reflection, and self-determined action. It is the discipline that ensures Eros does not spiral into pure chaos. Eros yearns for expansion and transformation, while Logos provides the structure necessary for this transformation to take place in a way that aligns with ethics. Eros requires Logos to be purposeful, and Logos requires Eros to be alive.